Hi, good afternoon, everyone in Central Canada, and good morning for those tuning in from the West. We're very happy to have you back to City Talk. This is Mary Rowe. I'm the president of the Canadian Urban Institute. We're doing these sessions a couple of times a week, and really appreciate people taking the time to participate with us on these, and also not only the panelists, but the people that will join us in the chat function and the participant function. CUI is in the connective tissue business, which is what we've been doing since COVID. We put up two platforms, citywatchcanada.ca and citysharecanada.ca, and then the third here is citytalkcanada.ca. These are all about us learning from each other, creating platforms where we can understand what's going on, how municipal governments are responding, how community institutions and individuals and groups of all kinds are stepping in to demonstrate what community resilience really looks like. And the City Talk series that these folks have agreed to come on to today is really about how do we make sense of what's going on. And every day is a new set of challenges and a new set of opportunities probably. So that's what we're keen to talk about today. We have been running these platforms really with partners and with the energy of partners and volunteers across the country. So if you've got bandwidth and you want to help us contribute to these things, we would love to have you. And just email covidresponse@cui.org, covidresponse@cui.org, and we have something for you to do for sure. So happy to have half hour of your time, an hour of your time, whatever you've got to help us build this kind of collective intelligence that we're doing. This program originates in Toronto, but there are people participating from across the country, and so they have their own attachments, but we here in Toronto are on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples from across Turtle Island. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, which were signed with multiple Anishinaabe nations. And we are always cognizant of the heritage that we, and of the land that we stand on, and that we continue to work and strive towards truth and reconciliation with Indigenous communities and our First Nations. The other thing that we acknowledge in these programs is that tens of thousands of Canadians are still engaged in first line response. They are saving lives, they are keeping people safe, and these conversations are operating in parallel to that, but we are not in any way supplanting that or acknowledging that many folks continue to be engaged in that intense level of activity, and we're supportive of it, and these conversations are a supplement to that. These chats tend to be focused on the practical, and we're asking people for the various domains that we tackle, what's working, what's not, and what do we think is next. And we're trying to avoid big, bold prognostications of people taking big, wild guesses. We're trying to stay grounded in the real, and that's why we've asked you to participate with us, because you have a direct engagement with folks on the ground working in cities and communities across the country. So that's a caveat. And this conversation is just the beginning. So we always say, we want everyone to engage, and you can do that on social media with #CityTalk. These broadcasts, these programs are not only live broadcasts, but they're recorded and then posted at canurb.org/CityTalk. And we also have a really active chat function in all of these. And any of you that have been on one of these know that all sorts of interesting stuff gets talked about in the chat. So please enable your system and please come in and join us on the chat. And when you post a comment on chat, we ask you to post not just to all panelists. You'll see there's a little toggle switch there. You can do all panelists and everyone. And please do that, because often people on the chat can answer really quickly whatever question you've got. And often people are posting resources here, and it's really been very, very rich. So we actually post the chats also at canurb.org. And that means that, unlike Vegas, things that stay in Vegas, if you post on the chat, it's going to live on the chat and people will see it on the chat. So just keep that in mind when you're chatting. The other thing I think we want to just make clear here is that we all have different perspectives, and these folks are coming on as individuals. They have particular jobs, they have affiliations, they may have clients, they may have client groups, they may have members, but we encourage people to talk as individuals, to appreciate that in these times it's hard to often get complete clarity within an organization about what the official position is. So we always try to encourage people to be candid with us You're not off the record quite, but just to be candid, and for us as an audience to appreciate that this is things are unfolding in real time, and we're all trying to navigate this as we go. So we want to just let everybody know that you've got permission to think out loud here with us and see where we end up. So let's start. This session is on immigration, and it is a pressing topic that is, I think, visible to us every day, because we know that Canada is a country that has had remarkable success because of ambitious settlement strategies and supports that have been in place for decades. And we've got 4 people here that are deeply engaged in these issues. And we are keen to hear from them what they see right now as being the pressing challenge, and realizing that we're going to talk obviously about immigrants and newcomers, and we're also going to talk about immigration policy in the future. So let's start, if we can, with what you're seeing right now. And I'm going to go first to Queenie Choo. We always go to the furthest afar. So we're happy to have you from Vancouver, and maybe you can tell us in a couple minutes what your organization is doing, but also what your focus is during COVID. What have you been seeing? Queenie, happy to have you, and welcome to City Talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you again, to Canadian Urban Institute for the invite to come and have this wonderful talk. And it's very timely, it's really relevant to what's going on, especially the COVID-19. At S.U.C.C.E.S.S, we are one of the largest nonprofit social service organization that helps support newcomers, new Canadians here throughout the journey. And certainly, this is a very important topic, especially, with this crisis across the globe. It happens, it affects everybody, in the communities, as well as those people that are local Canadian or newcomers as well. So first of all, I think that it's not unknown to anybody else with the huge employment loss and business shutdown. There is a significant economic vulnerability. Even before COVID-19, immigrants, particularly recent immigrant, 5 years or less in Canada, are more likely to be low income as compared to Canadian-born population. According to the Census 2016 indicates in Metro Vancouver, the prevalence of low immigrant among Canadian-born population is about 11.9% to 12%. Immigrant population is about 20.5%, and recent immigrant population, like 5 years or less in Canada, is about 33.6%. So you can see the differential percentage of the income level that are impacting the newcomers. So with COVID-19, we're seeing more this happening more than ever. 40% of the recent immigrants, they said they had a hard time to pay their bills, and also with the current crisis, versus 24% of the non-immigrants. So this is hard facts. So 42% of the recent immigrants said that they have a hard time to pay their mortgage or rent during the COVID-19 crisis, versus 18% of the non-immigrants. So you can see it's really hitting the newcomers hard, especially the recent immigrants. So there's a lot of challenges also by new immigrants to navigate in the system to get the subsidy. So I think one is very good by the governments to provide those provisions of financial support. But the other hand is, it has been a very hard challenge for new immigrants to come in and not having the language skill and also digital skill in order to navigate and access the system. So this is adding to the challenge of the new immigrants, especially during this time of COVID-19 impacting significantly, also about the concern of health and safety. And certainly this is also very important for everyone to know health at this time more than ever, about the cross-infection, how to look at PPE and what needs to be done in terms of coughing, sneezing etiquette, and social distancing. So all the safety about the racism and you know, the issue about what's going on, you know, the COVID-19 as being racialized. I'm going to stop for a moment because these are the top concerns that we heard in our community.
Great, thank you. Queenie, when you're talking about those statistics, are those for British Columbia?
Actually, this is from the census 2016, and it indicates in Metro Vancouver.
Oh, I see. Okay, so these are trends that pre-existed. One of the things that we've been talking about on these talks is that COVID's been a particle accelerator. You know, it's taken all the pre-existing things that were already festering before COVID and are now manifesting like crazy. Okay, so thank you for that. We'll get you started on that. Yasir, can we go to you next, please? Yasir Naqvi. Where are you, Yasir? Are you in Ottawa today?
I am in Ottawa, my hometown. Thank you, Mary, and thank you to Canadian Urban Institute's team for enabling this very important conversation. I am the CEO of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship. The Institute was co-founded by our former Governor General, the Right Honorable Adrian Clarkson, and John Ralston Saul almost 15 years ago. The aim of our organization is to really promote and foster active citizenship, inclusion, and belonging among all Canadian citizens, but of course, we focus a lot on new Canadian citizens. I think you just made a very valid point that a lot of the challenges that we're seeing exacerbated due to COVID-19, something that have been festering for some time. So one of the areas that we've been working on in order to foster inclusion is to look at how disinformation and misinformation online and offline had existed for a long time towards immigrants, towards people of different background, how racism festers in those type of forum. And what we're seeing during the COVID-19 crisis, that the anxiety as a result of this crisis is being exploited by the same people who've sowed fear towards the other, and now using the disease, and this is not new, disease has been used often in the past as a way to divide people, and is being amplified at the moment. So we at the Institute for Canadian Citizenship are really taking on that particular issue of making sure that we educate and make people aware that this is a health crisis with some serious economic and social impact, but it's not a fault of another particular group. And the way to get out of this crisis successfully is for us to really embrace inclusion as we have done so in Canada, to actually celebrate the differences we have and work together as a society and as a country and as citizens so that we can come out of it stronger.
Thank you. Lisa, can we go to you now? Lisa Lalande from the Century Initiative.
Sure. Thank you so much as well. I echo the thanks for including me and Century on today's panel. And I thought I'd just start with just a really brief overview of Century, because not everyone will know who we are. So Century Initiative aims to be a voice for Canada's future, encouraging Canadians to think longer term about the kind of country we want to leave our children, our grandchildren, and their children. So if future generations that we may not be around to see, are going to enjoy the same Canada that we know and love, a Canada that offers personal freedoms, a quality of life that is the envy of the world, we need to plan for it. So we need to plan for a future. So our work is straightforward. We focus on initiatives and priorities, on issues that will help the country, that will help the country's policymakers, business and community leaders think long-term and then take steps today that will create the tomorrow for future Canadian generations. So what that means in practice is we aim to inform and advance policies and priorities that will create the conditions for Canada to thrive, for everyone to grow well into the future. We educate Canadians on the importance of long-term planning and smart population growth, strategic population growth. And we focus in on specific areas, so immigration, urban development, early childhood supports, employment and entrepreneurship and education. And we convene people to better understand the issues, to share knowledge, and to amplify the work of other experts in these domains. So for us, you know, what we've been seeing, because I know the aim for this is to be really practical, and some of this will be repeated, I'm sure, but what we're seeing is obviously this pandemic is having a radical impact on communities of all kinds. For immigrant communities, though, I think the challenges that one would normally face coming to a new country, they're exacerbated in this current situation. Their social, economic, employment positions are much more precarious to begin with. And so that the impact of this extended shutdown is going to have a major impact on personal and family finances. And this was actually echoed in a recent Statistics Canada data that was released, I think it was released earlier this week, that Canadian-born individuals, that immigrants are significantly more likely than Canadian-born individuals to report that COVID-19 will have a major or moderate impact on their finances. And we know, it was mentioned earlier, that immigrants are disproportionately employed in frontline service industries. So that means they're exposed to reduced hours, even layoffs in some circumstances. And for those in essential services, it means that they have greater exposure to infection from the virus. So many of them can't shelter in place and they can't work from home. So this means that many immigrants and newcomer employees are facing really, really difficult trade-offs between earning an income on one hand and risking their lives on the other. So in addition, I think what we're seeing is that, you know, many newcomers rely on services such as language training, social services, etc. Those are typically provided face-to-face, so they don't have access to those, which can be very isolating. And it was noted earlier, unfortunately, we are seeing an increased incidence of racism directed at immigrants, particularly Asian communities. Some groups of immigrants and newcomers are subject to increased stigmatization and discrimination. So I'm going to ground it in an example. Some Cargill and JBS meatpacking employees have reported that they are restricted from entering grocery stores and banks in their local community, regardless of their status, their COVID-19 status. So for immigrant communities, there are many, many challenges that are only being exacerbated by the current crisis.
Yeah, it's an interesting question how vulnerable we're going to be now when we go through this period. So thanks, Yasir and Lisa. Senator Omidvar, can we hear from you last, and then we'll open it up. Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, Mary, and it's always a pleasure to be in such wonderful company. One gets tired of talking to oneself in these times. I sort of see a number of contradictions and some opportunities. You've asked us to be practical as well. So I think I cannot remember another time when the reach and depth of the immigrant reality has been put on such full display as it has today. I was speaking to a neighbor of mine who has been infected and been cleared, and she told me that from the get-go, from the first responders in emergency, to the doctors, to the nurses, to the dietitians, to the administration, to the release back from the pharmacy into her home, every point of interaction was fronted by someone who was clearly not born in Canada in the first or the second generation. So the immigrant reality in the front line, whether you define frontline as doctors and nurses, or you define it as I do now more globally in the terms of grocery store clerks, garbage pickups. It is the immigrant face of our urban cities. And I think this has been put on full display. Contradictorily, on the other hand, as Yasir and Lisa have pointed out, and Queenie as well, there is a rise in protectionism, nativism, whatever you may call it. So on the one hand, we have this full display of immigrants at the front, keeping us safe and secure. And on the other hand, we have a rise in racist sentiment. And I'm predicting that the discussions on immigration policy, who gets in, how they get in, will be impacted quite severely in the short and maybe even the longer term. And these things are not just in the hands of our country. After all, would-be immigrants may choose to sacrifice prosperity in a new country for safety and security at home. I mean, all of these things play in. But when I think about our cities and their future, and I think I certainly believe, as I do most of you as well, that immigration has been a driver of prosperity in Canada's cities. There's absolutely no doubt about that. They have created inequities, they have created challenges, but overall, the story of immigrant success is parallel to the story of Canada, the success of Canada's cities. And there's an opportunity there because cities are able to manage their governance and their processes in a more inclusive way. Because of local governance, it's closest to the people, they're able to include people, they're able to talk directly to people. The word citizenship and cities is closely linked. It's no accident that they are closely linked, but it's expressed differently than at the national level. So I think one of the great opportunities of the day will be cities reaching out more to their citizens, including them more as they redesign urban spacing policies, urban zoning policies, because all of this will play into the mix. And there is a policy opportunity as well. As we all know, Canada, immigration is a shared jurisdiction between the federal government and the provincial government. There is a robust program for provincial nominees. There is a tiny program, 5,000 spots for municipal nominees. I think the time has now come to expand the conversation once again, to have municipalities play a more vibrant role at the immigrant selection table than they have been allowed to in the past, and to expand that lever somewhat as we rethink in this country what is an essential occupation.
Right.
You know, our entire immigration selection policy is addicted, and I use that word with care, but it is, we are addicted to skilled immigrants. Well, guess what? Who are the essential immigrants we need? We need those seasonal agricultural workers to protect our food supply. We need those personal support workers. We need those doctors who are not able to practice because of licensing barriers to be able to have an opportunity in our long-term care homes so that there is a level and depth of support for our senior citizens. So these are all, you can look at them as challenges or you can look at them as opportunities. My family name is Omidvar, which in Persian means hope. So I will look for the opportunity.
Mary, if I may.
Yes, go ahead, Yasir.
You know, I think the senator is raising a very good point in terms of the role, where the cities lie in this crisis, and most importantly, the solutions around the cities. They are the front line deliverer of services, and they are impacted in terms of looking at the orders of government. They're impacted the most because they have no real taxing authority except for property taxes and user fees. So, and if you look at cities, and if you look at some of the data that's coming out from cities across the country, big and small, they're in a dire strait right now. And I think very strongly, and I think the senator will agree, and others as well, that in terms of the solutions, we need to double down on the solutions that we were working on, such as immigration levels. I mean, it's heartening to see that Canada has said, the minister has said, that we will not be looking at reducing our immigration levels. That is a good thing, that we will continue on our trend to up to about 390,000 people per year on average by 2022. Unlike United States, that has put a halt on immigration, which is a wrong policy decision they have made. We may want to look at bringing more people in order to fuel the economic growth. And the senator recently wrote a very good piece in IRPP exactly on that issue, that one of the key ingredients for economic growth is people, is labor, and biggest source is the immigrants we bring in. But the second big issue that we've been facing, and we were talking about it up to about 8 weeks ago, and we stopped talking during this COVID crisis, is housing, affordable housing, both in terms of rental market, but affordable ownership of housing as well. That crisis continues to loom, and it actually has become even more dire now that people have lost their jobs. Again, solutions around that really needs to be looked at. And I think we may have to expand our horizon a bit, where we look at both more intensification, which is a sustainable way of doing things, but maybe also look at other ways of increasing supply of housing. I know in my city, for example, in Ottawa, they're looking at expanding the boundaries of the city. And I know it's a controversial issue, but we know that there is an issue around supply and demand. And a lot of immigrants who come to Canada, they come with a great dream of owning a home, which they have not had the opportunity in the countries they come from, but affordability becomes an issue. All this to say that I think we may have to look at doubling down on the solutions, as opposed to retracting from the kind of public policy solutions we were working on up to 8 weeks ago before this crisis hit us.
So Mary, do you mind if I jump in?
Go.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I wanted to just build off the last 2 points that both panelists shared. There's a lot of anxiety right now. A lot of people are afraid. They're anxious. So to talk about building a case for population growth,
really hard,
maybe out of tune, right, with what Canadians are going through, because some of them are just, they want to survive, they don't know how to pay their bills. But I mean, there's a strong economic case for population growth. And ultimately the facts are that our worker to retiree ratio is declining. So without a boost in immigration or a giant boost in fertility rates, Canada's population will decline and its labor force will shrink. This means that we will no longer be able to afford our social programs or health care in Canada. So this is where I was going back to my earlier point about we need a plan for the future, and we need to think really strategically about what population growth means, because population growth on its own is not the solution. It's a multifaceted policy agenda that includes urban planning, effective urban planning, employment and entrepreneurship, regulatory innovation and entrepreneurship. It includes multiple different opportunities.
But Lisa, you've been saying yourself that it's a time of stress for folks. So. Right. Not everybody necessarily agrees with your premise. I think that's the vulnerability that we have now. And I wonder if the senator wants to speak to this. There's somebody on the chat who's actually saying, it's John Meyer. Did you see the comment? He's actually saying, wait a second, since we've had a lot of immigration, our per capita income has actually dropped. And you folks are all identifying that there are vulnerabilities in our system now. And newcomers, as Yasir said, we're seeing all sorts of things manifesting that were there, and they're much worse now. And newcomers and people of color and immigrants are the ones that we're now dependent on, and they're the ones that are most vulnerable. So, Ratna, do you want to speak a bit to this about, Lisa's talking about making a long-term case, but I'm interested what your perspective is. Go ahead, Senator.
I'd like to make 2 points and address the question in the panel, in the chat, sorry.
Yeah.
One is that fear is a huge motivator to doing things or not doing things. And I'll go back to history. In 1907, Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier made a pledge to double the population of Canada. And he did so by bringing in immigrants from cold weather farming jurisdictions like Ukraine, Poland, Germany, etc. But there's a little footnote to this, and the footnote is this. The urgency to settle the West was not just out of a desire to grow our country economically and population-wise, but there was also a fear that if we didn't stake out with people our position in Manitoba and Saskatchewan and Alberta, that we would be vulnerable to an American infiltration. So now we have fear of another crime.
We have a different kind of fear. Can this fear motivate us in another way? I mean, I hear, Lisa, your long-term point, if we don't build the population, but right now people will argue, but wait a sec, we can't seem to support the population we have. So how do we, Queenie, what about that? You gave us those statistics at the beginning about how disproportionately represented newcomers are and people of color are and immigrants are in all the ways in which the system is failing. So what do you think?
Well, I think that it's important. I agree with Lisa, to talk about the social support system that needs to be in place. When you throw somebody kind of in the bus, it does not mean that the person is able to self-propel themselves along that journey. I think that as a responsible community and country, we needed to enable those people to succeed in the Canadian journey. So that is vitally important. But also there are studies to demonstrate that while even whether they are immigrants or refugees coming to Canada, in the long run, they are going to contribute even more than ever comparing to other Canadians, so I think we needed to look at the long term. The one thing I also wanted to point out is also our aging population. Mm-hmm. I think it's also indicated very well in Senator Ratna Omidvar's article. If we don't look at our population, it's going to decline significantly in 20 or 30 years down the road. I think as a country, we need to be, long-term thinking. We needed to look at, how are we going to prepare ourselves for the future, not just, right now, but into the future. I think that it is important that we look at how we're going to get our economy up and running, how we're going to get people employed, and significantly, once we open up with the country from the recovery of the COVID in a new normal, what are the enabling factors to help not only new Canadians, but also local Canadian? How are we going to do that all together well in an inclusive community? And that's important. This is not the time to be divisive among us.
Before I go to you, Yasir,
this is the time we needed to kind of stick together, shoulder to shoulders, to show Canadians' way of doing things, and that embraced the diversity and inclusion.
Before I go to Yasir, Queenie, do you differentiate between refugees and immigrants? Because we're getting lots of questions about that. Newcomers are not all the same. Do you have a particular sense of how you approach that in terms of the different ways in which people arrive here?
We all different. Each
right.
Canadian is different.
Right.
So I think to kind of, labeling people is not the good way. of doing things. I think that we need to look at individuals' needs, whether you are immigrant, whether you are refugees, or whether you are local born Canadian. I think it's important to look at that individuality, the contribution, the talents that they bring to our country. I think those are important assets for our community, and we need to embrace it. So rather than labeling your refugees and hence, you know, you have that labeling, I think it's important to look at the asset they bring to our country.
Yeah, Yasir and then Ratna. Go ahead, Yasir.
You know, the fact is that that whenever there is economic anxiety, immigrants are the first one to get blamed. When their unemployment is high, people say, you know, why somebody else is taking away my job. This crisis is even, I think it's even more difficult one because there's also a health crisis at the same time. So there's an anxiety associated with the pandemic, and you know, what does that mean for my health? And so we're seeing it's right now getting manifested, that anxiety, by, you know, blaming somebody else, especially people of Chinese background, saying somehow you brought this disease and you're to be blamed for, and that's just overt racism. There's nothing to it, and we should call it as such, and we need to fight against it and counter it. But it will transform into an anxiety towards others, towards immigrants, when we get out of our physically distant world and get reintegrated back into the society, and people start looking for jobs. So we have to be extremely mindful of that this is not new and this will happen. Mary, I'm going to challenge you, the point you were making to Lisa's point. Lisa's not talking about the future. Lisa is talking about today. We need immigrants today to grow the economy. We need, as much as immigrants are helping us right now to get out of this healthcare crisis by being frontline workers in healthcare and in every other sector. I mean, it's really interesting to see that all of a sudden we are able to give temporary licenses to people practice medicine or nursing, but somehow in the long run we were not able to. I better hope that we don't go back to the old ways and take their license away, because if they were good enough to save lives today, they're good enough to save lives tomorrow and day after tomorrow, and help build our cities, our communities, and our country. That's the doubling down I'm talking about, that we need to engage in to make these important points and counter the anxieties. And to Lisa's points, and the point the Century Initiative has been talking about, is that this is a challenge of not the future, this is a challenge of the issue because of our declining birth rate. And I think if anything, this crisis has shown, especially towards our elderly, and how disproportionately they have been impacted by this crisis, that we need to do more to support them, that we cannot turn our backs towards them. They are citizens as well. And this is a very adverse demonstration of ageism that we're seeing. And the best way to do that is to make sure that we have more people in this great country of ours who are properly trained and given the opportunities to help contribute, help grow this economy, so that we have the tax base, but also be in professions where we can be helping people like our elderly.
Thanks, Yasir. Senator, I'm going to come to you. I just before I do, you mentioned the point about citizenship in cities being so closely aligned in terms of their root, and I remember some work you and I did together many years ago where we talked about that. But isn't it interesting that we refer to citizens rather in a general way, but we know that hundreds of thousands of people living in cities are not citizens; they are residents. And it sort of begs the question, which is raised on the chat, should we be changing the eligibility to vote in municipal elections? Is that another tool in addition to the one you were talking about, a municipal nominee program, to strengthen the urban capacity to be able to have more immigrants come? Anyway, go ahead.
That is taking me back some 20 years, I think, Mary. And I think perhaps a little differently about that question now, and that's possibly because I breathe in the thin air of Ottawa.
Sure.
The citizenship is is, I would say, under a certain amount of stress, pressure and stress because of national policies, because of global migration policies. And I would want to do everything I can to maintain the current uptake of citizenship at the national level. Whether that's enhanced or not, if locals, if you're allowed to vote in local elections, I don't know, but I've heard that argument. But I certainly believe in more participation is better than less. And I remember one of the most succinct arguments that I heard around local citizenship and the local franchise was that there were whole tracts of housing developments in Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal where immigrants were living. They weren't citizens, and therefore the local politicians rarely bothered to go and visit these towers or these housing estates, because after all, they didn't vote. So I think there's some truth to have that discussion again. But I would want to some of the chats around, yes, immigration has created commercial prosperity. I would argue with that, but it is correct to point out that it has an underbelly, and there is an underbelly of inequity and economic deprivation at the bottom end of the scale. And I think maybe the time has come for us to think about essential work and essential pay. Mm-hmm. Should go hand in hand. Mm-hmm. And I know of city-led movements starting in London, migrating to Los Angeles, over to Vancouver, around local living wages, mm-hmm. Which would determine, in our city, for example, in Toronto, it's perfectly within the mandate of our city council to create an essential worker living wage. So it is no longer just minimum wage, but it is higher than minimum wage, possibly by some degree. And this would enable the city to work with those suppliers who subscribe to it, so that in fact a rising tide would lift all boats. I think we can't, on the one hand, say that we need absolutely to work in our cities or in our institutions and to keep us safe, and then not pay them in a commensurate manner. So I think there's an opportunity there. There are, by the way, a whole lot of unanswered questions around the future of migration to Canada, the future of immigration to cities, based on a whole number of questions that we cannot answer. And I'm just thinking that these are important to put on the table. We don't know, for instance, whether commercial businesses, corporations will embrace the remote work possibility, because it seems to have worked quite well. So they are asking themselves, why do we need this high-priced real estate down on Bay Street?
Well, some of them are asking them that. Some of them are asking themselves that.
So what if the high-priced housing in Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal is impacted because people are choosing to work from home, or corporations are choosing to work from home? This would free up, Yasir, more housing, more affordable housing places. What would it do to transportation? Mm-hmm. Maybe less people would be using urban transport. So there's a whole bunch of things I don't know, and I would love to have this conversation back in a year when we know a little bit more. And finally, we don't know. I've been talking to a lot of people overseas. They've put their migration plans on hold. Not just their travel plans. Right. They've put their migration plans on hold because they don't know what they will face in the travel in a new country. So there's a whole bunch of things we don't know, and I would love to have this conversation again.
We've got your number, Ratna. We'll make sure we have it again. And we probably won't wait a year, because COVID time accelerates everything. So what used to be a year is now 2 months. Lisa,
yeah,
I want to ask you a question first, though. Okay. On the chat, people on the chat are asking, yeah. Do we have to, is growth necessarily a given? Maybe growth isn't a good thing. And are there costs to growth? And should we be looking at growth in a different kind of way? I can see that got people going. Yasir's shaking his head. Lisa.
I mean, Yasir brought up a good point. we're an aging society, and we're becoming a country of old people. And an aging society has economic implications. And it means that there'll be more people working to try to cover the expenses of our aging population.
Right.
We will no longer be in a position to afford the programs that we have in place today. So it speaks to what kind of future do we want for our children, our grandchildren, and their children. And I mean, the fact is, if we maintain our current pace of immigration, Canada's GDP growth is expected to slow.
I mean, this is pre-COVID.
It's
This is
expected to
pre-COVID
slow.
You're talking the
Right.
rate pre-COVID, right?
Right. And so, I mean, we were already, we were already expecting a rise for healthcare costs. We're going to rise annually an average of 4% in the coming decade as our population ages. So what are those costs going to be now? I wanted to speak to one point, and I think it's an important one, and it's on attitudes, Canadian attitudes towards immigration. It is possible that with the pandemic, it could further exacerbate xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment. It's a legitimate question. Will that happen in Canada? Because we're already seeing anecdotally in the news that this is happening in some communities. But the fact is, we don't really know the depth and breadth of how far that goes for Canadians. And if you look at, in 2019, Environics, they do a study on Canadian perceptions of immigration. And as a whole, this is 2019, this is pre-pandemic, I know, but as a whole, they continue to be more positive than negative about the number of immigrants arriving in Canada and the benefits they bring. And public concerns about whether newcomers are adequately embracing Canadian values and legitimacy of refugee claimants did not increase from 2018 to 2019. They stayed the same.
Wow.
And they weren't a part, immigration issues were not a significant part at all of our last election. So right. I actually think when it's done right, I think most Canadians will embrace the notion of immigration and recognize the economic and other contributions they make to our country. But I think Ratna's right. In light of COVID, there's just so many factors and so many things changing and so much anxiety that it's difficult to predict.
Right. Yeah, sir.
Yeah, you know, I want to address the question around growth because I hear about this often. I think the panelists know this, that in my past life, I was a politician, represented a downtown riding here in Ottawa. And as a result, I knocked on doors every weekend. And more often than not, I used to hear two things when I ask people, how can I help you? One, they will say, lower my taxes, as many people say. And second thing, they will say, and I waited 9 hours in ER, so I need better healthcare. Collect less money, spend more, right? Yeah. And once I got confident enough to start challenging people, I said, well, that it's not going to happen if we, money in, money out. If we need money to pay for these services, healthcare is the most expensive service to deliver. And you cannot lower your taxes. But there is another way of doing it, is by increasing your tax base. If you have more people working, then they will pay more taxes, and that money will go into providing the essential services we need. So to Lisa's point, as we live in an aging country where we are required, rightly so, to take care of our elders, and I think COVID has really shown the fault lines in our system. Yeah. The solution is not to stop immigration, to preserve the few jobs that we don't have enough people to preserve, and the tax base is not sufficient enough, because I think we'll be in a dire problem. The solution is to bring more people in and make sure we just don't bring them in to become Uber drivers, and nothing against Uber drivers, but to actually create a pathway for them to fulfill the economic potential so that they can work in their chosen profession and be able to perform and be part of the society, in an inclusive society, at the level that they deserve. So this way, they make good money, they pay more taxes, and those taxes get used to fulfill our services. I mean, it's a win-win for all of us. And sometimes I just find it, I don't know, all of us sitting here maybe don't do a good job in making that case or demonstrating that the outcome is a more inclusive and prosperous country that we all are absolutely committed to building.
I'm going to suggest for the next few minutes that we just focus, if we can, on the specifics around newcomers now and what their experience is now as they recover. At CUI, we've, as I said, we've had several of these conversations, and housing was one of them. And it was identified that we've got all sorts of challenges with housing that pre-existed. We've got forgotten densities, Jay Pitter's term, where you've got folks living too dense and not safe, often newcomers, often people of color. And how do we do that better? And as you said, Yasir, on licensure, good grief, if all of a sudden someone is allowed to practice, but then afterwards they're suddenly not, can we find ways to use the COVID experience to catalyze us into a better place around densities, around licensure? What else? What about business recovery? We've got something at CUI we're leading called Bring Back Main Street, and we're focusing heavily there on Main Street businesses, many of which are owned and operated by immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
So anybody want to, Queenie, do you want to talk a little bit about that, about the kind
Sure.
of...
Housing is so fundamental to enable people to develop that community and social connection opportunities and where they're going to reside. And the other piece is also transportation, especially in an urban area, how that public transit is going to be able to help people to go from point A to point B, especially for employment, for newcomers. So, the mobility is vitally important. Also, I want to touch on a little bit about families. Family of the immigrants, the newcomers, how are we going to support them, the parenting, really truly, how are we going to help them to integrate into our Canadian society? This is so vitally important, whether it's healthcare, transportation, education, those are all encompassing. And the other piece you touch on very importantly is about the foreign credential recognition. Being an immigrant before, I was a nurse trained in the UK, and when I come to Canada, I still have to go through the credentialing process. Absolutely, right? Because Canada want to protect the safety of the public in terms of healthcare. I totally understand that. But I think that the whole system needs to be taking a look at the process so that it does not present some roadblocks for newcomers in order to get their licensure. That's very real. And I have personal experience. Even moving from Alberta to BC, I have to make sure I get the transferability. Like I practice as an RN, how come it's different from province to province? It's kind of...
can accelerate that? I mean, do you think that COVID's created a kind of crisis, and so suddenly we did? We also have offered an annual income kind of device too. There are certain things that we seem to suddenly be able to do. Queenie, do you think there's a chance that we will be able to make these things stick?
Well, I'm hoping there are a number of things that I hope that they will stick. One is care for the seniors.
Right.
Really fundamentally have to look at, in the whole long-term care system, how we care for our seniors. Secondly is how we credential people. Is it going to be the same as before, after the COVID? So I think the whole kind of credentialing and how will help us to the newcomers or local Canadians to succeed. I think it's a very fundamental question. If we work in the COVID, during COVID crisis, how come it's a different system post-COVID? So these are the things we needed to take a look at, fundamentally asking ourselves what makes sense and how we're going to bring value to the community rather than being divisive.
Got it. Ratna.
Well, I think let's start with trite observation. but it's true. Let's not let a crisis go to waste. This crisis will teach us things about our nation, about ourselves, about how we respond. And I think it's important to use that lever to think about things and accelerate some of the solutions that have been proposed. I think all of us around the panel agree on the linkage between population and growth and prosperity. Now, there's a choice to be made. We can be a smaller nation. Fair enough. There are enough people in the chat room who are proposing, a reduced economic, a reduced population. But I think there are consequences for this. We are a very small country in terms of population. And if we want our products and our goods and our services to attract a market, the market is not in Canada. It has to be also outside. And immigration makes us global, it makes us pluralistic, it makes us part of the global network, and that I think a middle country, a middle power like Canada must have. I believe the question about refugees, and I want to use a little bit of my time, Mary, to address that. I think every human being is unique, but I think just as there is a differentiated impact on certain populations during the crisis, let's think about kids and mental health, let's think about women in shelters, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that for those refugees who have arrived in Canada in the last year or two, who are struggling to get their Canadian legs a little, that this crisis has created a significant challenge to them as they move forward. So I wish that this conversation will appreciate that particular context of a refugee's life. They have less social capital, they have less economic capital. If they're fortunate enough to have a sponsor, a private sponsor, then that becomes a little different. But to assume that they are tech savvy after having lived in camps for God knows how many years, and I've sponsored a family who's done that, I think it's a stretch. So I think we want to recognize the reality of isolation that may impact differently on refugee families. And I think that needs to be appreciated by us. And finally, I would like to say that there's a variance of opinion on this. I personally was very relieved that immigration was not a headline issue in the last election, because in the meantime, I have learned that it is one of those issues. You can have all the evidence, Lisa, Yasir, Queenie, all the evidence in the world lined up, and there will come one anecdote, and boom, boom, the conversation gets hijacked. So I'm personally happy. I don't believe as a nation, especially in a crisis, we're at the stage where we can have a mature, nuanced conversation for the long term. So I would hope that it's business as not as usual, but business going forward in the new normal. And the new normal may well propel cities to the front. It may well make us think differently about the kinds of qualities and competencies that immigrants need to have in order to put them at the top of the pecking range, and that we may need to rethink our compensation for them, whether it's private compensation or whether it's government. There's talk in the chat room about MINCOM. There are 50 senators who are urging the government to use this opportunity and launch a basic minimum income program as advocated by former Senator Arthur Eggleton of Toronto. So these are all opportunities to not let a crisis go to waste.
30 seconds to the other three in terms of not letting this crisis go to waste. Lisa, what if there's something you'd like to see stick?
Yeah.
What is it?
Well, I think that I want to reinforce, we're all feeling really anxious right now. We're uncertain about what the future is going to hold. The key takeaway here is that there's a certain amount of social and economic security that comes with a bigger country. if we're bigger, we won't necessarily feel small in the face of larger, more dominating countries. And we can play a global leadership role particularly in the issue of immigration, demonstrating to other countries that we can be both economically prosperous and socially inclusive. Those two things can exist together. And this leadership role, in my view, is needed now more than ever.
Yasir?
You know, to be Canadian is to be compassionate. And so I really hope that we don't lose our compassion. Even though we've been asked to physically distance ourselves, this is an opportunity to be even more socially inclusive towards each other. I continue to remind people that find ways to reach out. Yes, we're trying to keep in touch through technology with our family members and stuff, but I hope we're doing the same with our neighbors to our right, to our left, in front of us. You know, let's reach out, make sure that they're doing okay. This is how you build a society. This is what the success of Canadian society has been. And we need to even be more laser focused on inclusion, make sure that nobody's left behind.
Last 30 seconds to you, Queenie. 30 seconds is all we've got.
Thank you. And this is a pleasure to talk about, to bring about the point of diversity. I see diversity as an asset to the country rather than adversarial to the country. I see diversity as, the means to get us to economic prosperity. And I think that we should embrace it more than ever after this COVID-19 crisis, to really leverage what we have, the talents that we bring to our country.
Thank you. I want to thank you for joining us today. There's lots and lots of topics that you are going to spur further conversation on, and this relationship between growth, equity, inclusion, and sustainability, and lots and lots for us to continue to talk on. And, you know, the good thing about this is that these conversations, it ain't over. We're not solving them in an hour. Lots and lots of work still to be done. Tomorrow we have Mayor Bowman from Winnipeg with us, and I hope that in the spirit of connective tissue across this country, that you all tune in and listen to what Mayor Bowman has been trying pre-COVID. He had a lot of interesting things going on in Winnipeg around some of the themes we've just talked about, equity and justice and inclusion and sustainability, and he'll be with us tomorrow at noon for a one-on-one with Mayor Bowman. Now, the last thing to say on this one, we experimented this time. We had to go at 11:30 Eastern because of one of the conflicts of the schedules of one of the participants. And we've had some feedback from younger participants who have children at home that it's difficult for them to tune in at noon Eastern. And so they'd like us to change the time. Here's the dilemma, folks. It's lunchtime somewhere everywhere. And so whatever time we put this at, someone is going to be on lunch. So we're going to mix it up a little bit, but we're going to generally try to be midday still in the Eastern time zone so that we don't drag people in Vancouver out of bed too early, and that we don't miss the Atlantic region who will want to be having their afternoon tea. So we'll continue with these times. But if you've got feedback on that, please fill out the questionnaire, the evaluation questionnaire that's in the chat. Give us some more feedback on that. And if I could just thank Ratna, Lisa, Yasir, and Queenie. Thank you for joining us. Very important topic.
Thank you.
And we are really happy to have you on City Talk, and the conversation continues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care. Bye, everyone.
Take care.